in the North, because African Americans in the North are suffering in many of the same ways, although slavery is not necessarily one of them, but in many of the same ways related to racism, as they would eventually in the South as freedmen. But really, there's a distrust against African Americans even in the North. There's kind of the expectation that they're not going to be good soldiers. There's a lot of things going on there. But the 54th Regiment, Massachusetts Regiment, really comes through as far as simultaneously making a protest against those injustices, but also proving on the battlefield in the assault on Fort Wagner that, yeah, they've got what it takes to be great soldiers. They've got what it takes to do the most difficult things, most sort of manly things possible. Even though, as the character Trip talks about at one point, when the war ends, it's not like things are going to be that much different necessarily for at least northern blacks. They're still going to have to face the same sort of disadvantages, discrimination, and all that sort of thing. So really, it's one of the ways that we see that the Civil War is sort of a prelude to American history after the war, in that it highlights the tensions which are going to go on and not necessarily be resolved. So Civil War does resolve a good number of things, but this is one of the things it doesn't resolve. Really, how will Black Americans be fully integrated into the nation as a whole and receive some true measure of equality? Also, while serving not just the 54th, but other regiments made up of black soldiers as well, many serve with distinction, as well as suffering heavy casualties, and even though sort of distrusted and kept back from major duty at first, eventually, like we talked about, there's 180,000 black soldiers in on the Union side. That's 10% of the entire army. It's one of the ways that the Union just massively overwhelms the South as far as just people in uniform, which comes to be part of Grant's eventually successful but very bloody strategy. Emancipation Proclamation, talked about that. Misplaced slide. So at Gettysburg, really what we have is Lee's last lunge, so to speak, into the North. It's not like the war ends here. The war doesn't end for another couple of years after this. But because of victories by the Union here at Gettysburg and also at Vicksburg, further west, on July 3rd and July 4th, in a row, in the two locations, massive implications from these wars. Really, it kind of shows from this point forward, the South is kind of they're fighting for a lost cause. There's no real way to win other than trying to break the resolve to fight on the northern side. But unfortunately for the South, kind of the opposite happens, partly because of Sherman's psychologically and economically devastating campaign through Georgia and the Carolinas. But had Antietam gone differently, we'd see a different sort of order of events, probably, as far as how the war would perhaps end. But yeah, that's something definitely to look into further and consider, is what would have happened if the Confederacy had won at Antietam. What would have happened if they'd won at Gettysburg? If they'd won at Gettysburg, Washington, D.C. is in big trouble. And what happens if the South takes Washington? I think we're going to see peace with slavery intact, and the Union unsuccessful in getting the seceding states back into itself. Let's talk about Grant just a moment. What we have him doing is kind of being the champion of the, if the enemy is out there, that's where we want to go. We just want to fight constantly. It's part of this total war strategy, but we just want to fight constantly. And it doesn't matter how many people we lose, they'll be losing people too. They can't stand to lose them, and we can. Really, the only place where he regrets this strategy is at Cold Harbor, where his just kind of bizarrely aggressive frontal assault against a well-fortified position kind of parallels what happens to Pickett in his charge against at Gettysburg. Why you would just throw endless amounts of people straight at a well-fortified enemy is beyond me. But happens at Gettysburg with Southern generals assaulting. It happens with Grant at Cold Harbor as he's charging straight into sort of a slaughter. But yeah, but his strategy, as ham-fisted as it sounds, eventually is the one that wins out. So while Grant and Lee are fighting it out in the Wilderness Campaign, then at Cold Harbor and all around Richmond, General Sherman is marching through the South, from Atlanta to the sea, so to speak. But his tactics go beyond even what Grant is doing. He's really just taking out everything in his path, whether it is of military significance or not. Operating behind enemy lines in really the heart of the South, just destroying stuff constantly. And this destruction, I mean, it lasts not just for the time of the war, but well beyond the end of the war. The South's economy is devastated, particularly by the type of tactics that Sherman is employing. But you could argue that Sherman's march, because it brought the war to a quicker finish, because it took out so much politically and psychologically from under the Southerners. You could say that by ending the war sooner, it reduced casualties, somehow saving lives. And this is an important question to really consider: the means and the ends involved in Sherman's march, the means and the ends of things such as, dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. Was it morally justified? Because you could argue that the number of deaths was lower overall, but the deaths involved were almost exclusively civilian. So, yeah, how to assess that is going to be an important thing going forward for U.S. history, generally speaking. Wilderness we just mentioned briefly, but this is where Lee and Grant are just trying to break each other's will, more or less. And kind of at the tail end of this campaign is where Lee eventually does have to surrender. He just doesn't have enough men to break through. Cold Harbor, touched on that. Grant, got him. Appomattox is the tail end of the war, where Lee is forced to surrender to Grant.